we found, contrary to perhaps what a lot of economics teaches us, but in a way that makes a lot of sense, that regions that are more equitable, that create more platforms for opportunity, actually generate more sustainable job growth and prosperity over the long haul.
From the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, this is Prosperity That Works with Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. Here, Dr. Purnell explores the evidence for shared prosperity as a smart economic strategy. In this episode, Dr. Purnell speaks with Dr. Manuel Pastor, distinguished professor at the University of Southern California and co-author with Dr. Chris Benner of Just Growth and Solidarity Economics. For more than a decade, their research has examined more than 200 metropolitan regions to understand a central question. Why do some regions grow stronger as they grow more equitable? Which regions are making progress on both equity and growth? What role do data, deliberation, and a shared sense of destiny play in shaping lasting economic success? And what can these lessons mean for St. Louis? Examining those questions and more, here are Drs. Purnell and Pastor.
Well, thank you very much, Manuel, for being with us today. I want to jump right into the conversation. You and Chris Benner, your colleague, have been critical to the way we've thought about our strategy here at the James S. McDonald Foundation and a lot of the regional work we're involved in now. I want you to take us back to some of this seminal research that you've done across regions, across the country over the past several decades, looking at their journey in terms of both economic growth and inclusion in that growth. What did you find? What were some of the key takeaways from that research?
So we've been doing research looking at regional growth and equity or distribution patterns. And I'd say there's kind of three big findings. One is that we found, contrary to perhaps what a lot of economics teaches us, but in a way that makes a lot of sense, that regions that are more equitable, that create more platforms for opportunity, actually generate more sustainable job growth and prosperity over the long haul. In a way, that's the antithesis of what economics often says. Sort of makes you think that inequality would be good for growth. But as we also know, inequality tends to create social tensions and an inability to create a growth model. Inequality leads to underinvestment in the next generation of workers, particularly if they're a different color or ethnicity than the current incumbent taxpayers. Inequality can lead to over-incarceration, which is tossing away talent, often permanently, that could fuel your economic growth. And so we've done a series of studies, several in fact, looking at the top couple hundred metropolitan regions demonstrating this. So then the second question becomes, if that's true, why doesn't everyone focus in on equity and growth together? So the next stage in our research was to do something economists don't often do. Talk to actual human beings. And so what we decided to do was to categorize regions by whether or not they were doing a really good job on growth, but not so good on bringing everyone along. Or if they were doing a really good job on equity, but the overall economy was stagnating. And then what were the regions that were bringing equity and growth together? And the central lesson, which was kind of interesting, was that while there were factors that mattered that might be considered to be more objective, like your education structure. And by the way, the education structure that made the most difference was having a robust community college system, because that tended to train people for the middle sector jobs, kept your middle class alive. Or whether or not you had the industries of the future rather than the industries of the past. whether or not you had immigrants, because immigrants help to revitalize your economy. So those are kind of objective factors. But when we found out and did our case studies, that the key thing was whether or not you had what we, God forbid, called a diverse and dynamic epistemic community. Apologies in advance. We had to use fancy words because some of this was an academic publication. But epistemic community is what you know, who you know it with. Diverse is a lot of different voices, ethnically, from different parts of the region, from different sectors, community, labor, business, government. Dynamic is you're able to, instead of just sticking with a plan, scenario plan, so that you're looking at what is changing and you can adjust to that. So we found where people created mechanisms for communities to come together, to talk about the future of the region, to create a regional identity, and in a way, regional partnerships and friendships across these sectors and usual boundaries that created the glue for a region to arrive at healthier solutions. The third thing I think we found was that it frequently took some agent or set of agents to make that happen. It didn't just happen on its own.
Yeah.
In some places like Grand Rapids, or to Grand Rapids was a really good example, it was business led. Or parts of the South where the business community said, if we want to pitch ourselves as part of the new South, we have to deal with racial inequality because that's sinking our reputation for other investors. It's leaving a big part of our workforce behind, etc. See some of that in Charlotte, some of that in Atlanta. So sometimes it's business led. Sometimes it's labor led. For example, in LA, labor unions really forced a conversation around equity for workers and communities. In other places, it's philanthropy led or civic leader led, where foundations could step in and play a role. So like any academic, let me repeat the big 3 points. Equity can lead to prosperity. Empirical studies demonstrate that's true. The secret of it is building a community of people who see that and are willing to work on that. And to make that happen, you need some instigator of action and conversation.
It's really helpful. I want to drill down a bit on this notion of inequality and the ways in which it drags on growth. So it's not just that it has this positive potential impact on prosperity, but it's also a drag on economic growth. Can you talk more about the relationship talk more about the detriments, talk more about what happens in places where inequality is allowed to run rampant? What are the kinds of things that prevents from happening?
So we've done a couple of different large-scale empirical models of this, but our last was actually prompted by work done by the International Monetary Fund, where they looked at countries around the world and they asked what countries within the developed and developing world, Europe and the United States, on the one hand, parts of Asia, kind of in the middle, Africa, Latin America, more developing. What were the factors that led to their inability to sustain growth over time? And they found that the single most important factor was the initial state of income inequality. And they explained that by virtue of that leading to underinvestment in education, some insecurity of property rights. Because when there's a lot of inequality and there's class resentment, then people aren't as interested in protecting the property rights of small businesses, of even big businesses, because they don't think they're ever going to benefit from profits being produced. So we decided to replicate that for the 200 largest metropolitan areas in the United States and found basically the same coefficient or size effect on the ability to sustain job growth We also found out that it was the single most statistically significant and consistent drag on growth. So let me explain why it is. First, if you have a lot of inequality and a lot of low wages, your businesses get used to low wage models so that instead of investing in higher tech industries, the growth industries of the future, they invest in low wage industries. For example, in the Central Valley of California, there's a expression DOA, which is meant to describe their industrial structure, which relies on development, which is cheap land and cheap labor building new houses, oil, and then agriculture. Agriculture relies on low wages. And what people say is that economic system, DOA, means that any high road growth path is DOA, dead on arrival, because you've got a bunch of businesses that are addicted to low wage labor. So it gets in the way of long-term prosperity. I think you also see that you get a lot of, again, underinvestment in education, with wealthier people opting for private schools to escape the public system, and lower income people of color being stuck in that system, which is not preparing people for their high wage jobs. I think the other mechanism has to do with social conflict and distrust. You know, California right now, we've got a big battle going on about whether or not to have a billionaire's tax. And that billionaire's tax would take 200 wealthiest people in California and apply a 5% wealth tax to their entire fortune. Some people think that's a good idea. People who think it's a bad idea worry that the wealthy people will leave and not generate jobs. But one thing to realize, the only reason that's coming up is because we've got these big chasms in prosperity. So people do not see themselves in the billionaires. They don't think, I can get there. They think the game is rigged. The wealth has been stolen. We need to grab some of it back. And that happens when you have a highly unequal situation. Last point proof for you, Jason, and for the podcast audience. If you ask the question, when did the U.S. economy do the best in terms of sustaining GDP growth, that's overall goods and services, sustaining wage growth, the median wage rising, and also sustaining the wage rising at the 20th percentile, the median, and the 80th percentile, meaning very equitable growth. It was between 1945 and about 1975. If you ask the question, what happened after that, is a huge shift in the distribution of income, where we went from the top 1% receiving about 10% of national income to today's figure, which is more than 25% of national income received by the top 1%. What happened in that era? Economic growth plunged, worker productivity rose, but wages basically flatlined. Lots of disparity. So there's a lot of evidence that when we all do better, we all do better. And I think making that argument central and felt and realized, I always like to tell people that I'm lucky enough at the University of Southern California to have an endowed chair. In fact, the chair, you can get a glimpse of it right back there. They actually give you a wooden chair. It's totally cool. But they actually also give you, in this particular case, quite a bit of money for research, for supporting my salary, for supporting a postdoc, for supporting our research institute. So I asked the guy who donated all the money, by the way, who was passed away just a year or two ago, was a center-right Republican. but really loved our work because it was rigorous and honest. But I asked him, Jerry, how did you become so rich? I was just curious. He said, well, I treated my customers right. I treated my workers right. I treated my suppliers right. And it all worked out. The business just grew. If you ask most business people, that's their common sense. If you treat your customers fairly, if you treat the people who work for you fairly, so they've got a stake in the enterprise, if you treat the people who are your suppliers who give you inputs fairly, your business will work out in the long run. If you're looking to constantly cheat your consumers, they're going to give you some pretty bad Yelp reviews. If you are working to deliver low wages, low as possible to your workers, they will leave. They will work hard. Your suppliers will disrupt your supply chain. So we know, what's really interesting is that we are taught that sort of buying low and selling high is the secret to profitability, but only to short-term profitability. It's buying fairly, selling fairly, treating your workers fairly. That's key to sustainability. That's what the businesses in your region know. That's why you've been able to bring some of those interests to the equity discussion that you're having in St. Louis, a region, by the way, which has generated pretty good economic growth, but unfortunately left too many people behind.
You're listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, with your host, JSMF President and CEO, Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. Today's guest, Dr. Manuel Pastor, has spent decades studying the economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities. He is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California and directs the Equity Research Institute at USC. His work examines how regions that focus on both equity and growth build more resilient economies. Here again are Drs. Purnell and Pastor.
So I want to pick up on this notion of what we can do intentionally in the St. Louis region to build the kind of energy and effort around addressing inequality. We've started talking about inclusion as the superior growth strategy, which kind of borrows from Angela Glover Blackwell's Equity as the Superior Growth Strategy from Policy Link. Talk about what can be done tangibly. When you were here in St. Louis with us talking to our board a couple of years ago, you mentioned data, deliberation, and destiny. Can you unpack what those 3Ds mean and how you've seen regions deploy those 3Ds in a way that can begin to address some of this inequality?
So the data piece is really important. And of course, I love it as an economist. But I think that one part of it is grounding everyone in the same reality. If it's possible to say, I don't really think people are poor and struggling, if it's possible to not grasp that someone with a criminal record could be a good worker if given the chance, and you might need some evidence to show that's possible. If you're not fully aware that immigrants are contributing to your economy by filling in places in the labor market that provide complementary labor, can help grow the economy. If you're not really being clear about where there are pockets of poverty and desperation, and there's places of opportunity, and what the distances are between them, data is really key because it creates a conversation you cannot run away from. You have to recognize the reality that's in those numbers. By the way, I think that's especially important for people like me who have long been concerned about equity, fairness, inclusion, because it's easy to paint us as emotional about the problem rather than coming in and saying, look, here are some facts. We may have some disagreements about what to do about them. Like perhaps you favor an approach that's much more driven by the civic sector and the faith community, and I really want government to be involved as well. But we agree that there's a problem here of wages that are inadequate for families to survive. So data is really important. The second thing, which we frequently refer to as the third, is destiny. And that is creating a sense of shared fate so that people understand that they are woven together. The way I think about this in a couple of different ways. Here in California, one of the counties that has the highest share of undocumented immigrants. You'd imagine it's one of our agricultural counties. They're not in the top 5. You would imagine it's LA. It's close. But LA is followed right by Santa Clara County, the heart of Silicon Valley. Because behind every software engineer is an army of nannies, food service workers, gardeners, many of whom are undocumented. And we tend to think that you all can have your biomed industry without actually also having restaurant workers, the people who are taking care of the elders and the children of those biomed workers, an entire health service industry that goes up around that has many different kinds of jobs. So understanding the nature of our interdependence is absolutely key. That's the shared destiny. But the other part is, how do you get people to see that? Deliberation, conversation is really key. Now, some of that's going to occur in the kinds of civic forums that you and other philanthropic institutions will put together. Some of it occurs in our faith communities, particularly when churches from different neighborhoods commit to visiting each other on a Sunday or a Saturday or whatever day of worship people have. One of the best things I've ever seen to occur that brings sectors together is encouraging senior citizens to help in naturalization classes where immigrants are learning English and learning civics, which, by the way, is super hard. It's very hard to pass that test. And what older, often whiter folks who might, you think, have kind of a xenophobic reaction, maybe that's part of where they would go because they're worried about their America slipping away. Begin to understand how eager are new immigrants to become part of this experiment, how much they want to learn about democracy and civics, how it is that you become American, not by dint of race or ethnicity or nativity, but rather by your belief in principles of dignity, community, and opportunity. And you bring people together. So deliberation isn't just talking heads. It's creating the opportunities for people to be able to see their destiny and then to ground their conversations in data.
That's powerful. And those are all things that we're trying to support through our foundation, but it has to grow in ripples. It has to go beyond just what we seed. That's a powerful vision of what's possible. And it's not necessarily what folks would expect an economist to say is necessary for long-term job growth and the prosperity of a region, but it's critical insight.
Well, there's a couple things about that which are crucial for looking forward. First is I've definitely learned as a methodologist that mixed methods is the way to go. We need really great quantitative models that can help us establish causality. We need random control trials where we are looking at a control group and a group that's been given the treatment or whatever policy we're trying to implement. But we also need to lift the black box and find out what people think, how things actually work. So these insights really come from that. The second thing is that we need to ask the question, what is our economy for? It's not really just to produce GDP. It's actually also about giving people opportunities for meaning and participation in ways that support democracy. It's very hard to do when people feel terrorized by ICE raids. It's very hard to do when people feel marginalized by racism. It's very hard to do when people feel desperate because of tough economic circumstances for them to find their way to meaning. But what people are asking for often is not just work, but meaningful work, kind of work that you and I think gives us meaning as well. And people are asking for that. And this is going to be increasingly important in a society where so much of our work is going to be replaced by AI, by artificial intelligence. And then we're going to have to ask the question, what's the meaning of work and what's the meaning of life? And it's going to be about meaning, about community, about bonding together.
You're listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, with your host, JSMF President and CEO, Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. JSMF envisions a thriving St. Louis region where inclusive growth elevates shared prosperity and quality of life. JSMF invests in organizations and initiatives that improve economic mobility for St. Louisans facing the starkest disparities, as a strategy to help build a more thriving St. Louis economy. Here again are Drs. Purnell and Pastor.
Can you talk more about the regions and what it actually looked like to have this kind of strong civic infrastructure? Like, what were the outcomes? What were the benefits of having those 3Ds in place?
So some positive examples which come from different political environments. One is San Antonio, Texas, which was experiencing a lot of demographic change. And for a very long time, the kind of white elite was trying to lock out of governance a growing Latino, a solid but not necessarily growing Black population. And that led to a lot of dysfunction. But when people began to get more comfortable with the idea of change, partly because community organizers got a lot of power and made things a little bit uncomfortable, you saw the business community come around, particularly under Henry Cisneros as mayor, later under Julian Castro and subsequent mayors. They grounded themselves in a data project called, this happened in the past, SA 2020. What would San Antonio look like in the year 2020? With a shared data profile, the community orgs and the business community came together to agree on a sales tax in, God forbid, Texas, to raise money for pre-K for kids in San Antonio, targeted first at kids living in the least advantaged neighborhoods. That should have hit all the liberal conservatives never going to vote for this buttons, but it had business support, philanthropic support, community support, because it was about the workforce of the future. That came out of a shared destiny, deliberations, in a database. You could move to Salt Lake City, which perhaps remarkably people don't realize is on its way to becoming majority people of color by 2035, because it's been a major receiver of immigrants. It's, by income distribution, one of the most equal places in the country, metro regions in the country. And there, what's happened, because they're much more of a small government kind of framework, is that a civic organization launched by philanthropy helped to create kind of regional dashboard with data, but then also scenarios of the future. And it helped that region agree on more compact development, steering more stuff to the city, agreed on making sure that its new light rail that went to the airport would have stops in some heavily Hispanic areas so that people could get jobs in both the downtown and at the airport, to have more of a conscious about making sure that the benefits would be spread equally. Now there, in no small part, the shared sense of shared destiny comes from the presence of the Mormon faith, but also that realization that they were becoming more immigrant and more people of color than the country. And remarkable fact, Utah had driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants 12 years before California. They would never call themselves a sanctuary state, but they tried to create work permits for undocumented residents of Utah 8 years ago. They weren't successful, but they tried. So that's really important. We also seen that civic impulse in Silicon Valley, something that eventually I called the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. By the way, that doesn't exist as much now in this Silicon Valley because it's become much more in the hands of a few small firms rather than a multiplicity of firms. People who seem to be really hanging on to power. So the advantages of equity can also be eroded away. The conversations can also be degraded over time. The sense of shared destiny can disappear unless you're constantly cultivating the ground and watering the flowers of discourse.
Yeah. So let's bring it back to St. Louis. And I'm pretty proud of the fact that our bringing you here to St. Louis has led to a love affair with our city and our region, a newfound love affair. But you looked at some St. Louis data. Can you tell us what you found about our hometown that was unique, and also where you see promise and opportunity to actually put some of these lessons that you have found into practice here in the St. Louis region?
So a lot of the stuff we've found would not be super surprising to you. Highly segregated. The changing suburbs exemplified by Ferguson, but certainly other suburbs changing as well, so that, thinking of changing demographics and poverty as being a city issue is no longer appropriate. So people need to have a regional perspective, even just with regard to that. I would say the thing, and not that surprising to you, but I think crucial, is a deep history of distrust. That is, people think, is this just one more initiative? Is this one more leadership scam where someone is pretending to care about equity, but they will leave the stage soon? And so one lesson from that is, I think you all have taken, is that you need to be persistent, that you need to understand that if someone says they don't trust you initially, that you just need to keep working at building trust till they come around to believing that you really are of goodwill. And that means, I remember advising once a mayor who called me rather distraught because I helped be the architect of conversations between business, city, sub communities that had been disadvantaged for a very long time. And this mayor said, Manuel, they don't trust me. I feel so hurt. And I said, get tough. Just keep going at it. And a couple of years later, that person has developed that level of trust, not by everyone. Some people remember the histories. But the thing I thought that was the most interesting about your region, it's not unique, but it is important to lift up, is that if you ask the question, if you look at, are you generating GDP growth and market opportunities? And are you actually generating some good paying jobs? The answer to those questions would be yes, yes, and kind of yes. But if you dove deep and said, let's look at people who grew up in St. Louis compared to people who grew up in other states, and who is getting those jobs, and what are their household levels of income, that's where the disparities are. So St. Louis is a place that's grown the place, but hasn't really grown as much opportunities for the people. And so the key thing is making the linkages to your local labor force. That, I think, was the big takeaway as a challenge.
That's helpful. Going back to the data, as we're doing this work, what should we be looking for as those first indicators that we're moving in the right direction from what you've observed about St. Louis?
So first, you need to understand that a lot of data is pretty slow moving. So we're often saying we really want to improve community health, and population health indicators don't move for a decade. Even if you want to say we want to improve wages, that's going to take a couple of years to show up. And you really want to dig deep into the data to do it. So I think it's very important to take a look at your community colleges. Who's coming out? Is that improving? And are they getting placed in jobs? I think one metric I would use is how many of your businesses have decided to host naturalization classes and efforts with their employees to be able to be helpful to them. How many have developed internal job training programs? How many of your bigger institutions have developed subcontracting relationships with your local, particularly minority or disadvantaged business entrepreneurs? Looking for those faster moving indicators that might be available in administrative data. The other secret about data, which I think is really critical, and this is data for deliberation, is to look at future data, meaning what are your demographic projections? When people understand that the vast majority of their workforce is going to be people of color, they start to think about the need to invest in that simply out of self-interest. When they understand that the growing sectors of the economy will be health, when they understand the aging of the population and the expansion of elder care. So we try as much as possible to make sure that we have some forward-looking indicators so that you're grounding the conversation in what can you do and what opportunities can you take advantage of. The Salinas metropolitan area consists of 3 big, 1 smaller cities that are pretty different. Salinas, which is mostly farm workers. Monterey, which has a military presence, but also a lot of wealthy people live right by the coast, and service industries that support them. And a town called Gilroy, that was the garlic capital of the world, but is now a kind of backwater suburb to the Silicon Valley. And if you took a current snapshot, you'd focus in on tourism and ag and construction, given that configuration. It also happens to be, for whatever set of reasons, a leading place for manufacturing personalized helicopter, basically hovercraft, that looks like it's going to succeed and become a major form of future transportation in our urban areas. So training for that industry, which is going to pay high wages, figuring out what kind of factories they need, orienting yourself toward that future could be very exciting, but you're not going to get it from the current data. You're going to get it from looking at the future projections.
Yeah. Looking forward. Well, Manuel, it's always great to be with you. I learn something every time I talk to you. I think the key takeaway for me is that you grow by including as many people as you can in your effort to grow. And that is truly the superior growth strategy. It's how do you create opportunity structures that allow for growth, and not just growth for the sake of growth, but as you pointed to, real participation in our economy and our democracy.
Before our publisher asked us to put a more academic title with colons and everything in the book that you're making a lot of reference to, Closing Community, we just wanted to call it Knowing Together, Growing Together. So how do you learn together in order to be able to grow together? And I'd be remiss, thank you for mentioning my co-author, Chris Benner, but I'd be remiss in saying that St. Louis region, I think, knows how blessed they are to have a leader like you in their midst. Chris and I have been very attracted to working with the foundation and with you because of the seriousness with which you take the mission of inclusive development, but also the seriousness with which you take data, rigorous research, and grounding ourselves not just in our values and emotions, but in our facts and empirical realities and practical possibilities about what we can do. So thanks for bringing us in.
Well, thank you very much. We've been inspired greatly by your scholarship. It continues to inform the work that we do, and it's a privilege to be in partnership with you. Thanks so much, Manuel.
You've been listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, with host Dr. Jason Q. Purnell, JSMF President and CEO. JSMF envisions a thriving St. Louis region where inclusive growth elevates shared prosperity and quality of life.